On the battlefields of World War II, American soldiers faced an array of weapons, from rifles and machine guns to artillery and grenades. But few inspired the kind of fear and revulsion that the flamethrower did. Unlike conventional weapons, which relied on bullets or shrapnel, the flamethrower brought fire itself into combat. A weapon that could engulf bunkers, trenches, and entire fortifications in a searing wall of flames. For the soldiers encountering it, the horror wasn't just in the destruction it caused, but in the very nature of the weapon. Fire is elemental, primal, and instinctively terrifying. Facing a flamethrower, a soldier wasn't just under attack. They were confronting one of humanity's oldest fears in its most lethal form. American GIs first encountered flamethrowers in Europe, particularly in the sieges of heavily fortified positions. Nazi soldiers had mounted them on armored vehicles and carried portable models into urban combat. In the Pacific theater, the dense jungles of islands like Iwo Jima or Okinawa created the perfect conditions for flamethrowers. Japanese defenders used caves, pillboxes, and bunkers to resist American assaults and conventional tactics. Rifle fire, grenades, or even tank support often proved insufficient. When flamethrowers were deployed, these positions could be neutralized. But the psychological impact on those facing the weapon was immediate and profound. The fear wasn't abstract. Soldiers would recount seeing fire erupt from a single burst, sweeping over a bunker or nest of defenders. The roar of the flame, the heat that could sear skin even at a distance, and the sight of an enemy consumed by fire created a kind of battlefield terror unlike anything else. Accounts from American troops describe moments of near paralysis. When the weapon's sheer horror made it difficult to act, soldiers didn't just fear being killed. They feared the slow, agonizing consequences that fire inflicted, even if the blast missed them directly. The idea of it, the knowledge that it could reach anywhere they might hide, instilled a deep, instinctual dread. This fear was compounded by the weapon's unpredictability. Unlike bullets, which traveled in straight lines, or artillery, which could be anticipated through sound and trajectory, fire spread unevenly. It licked along surfaces, crept through bunkers, and followed the contours of trenches and caves in ways soldiers could not easily counter. The operator of the flamethrower became a living source of horror, a human embodiment of death that could reach you wherever you tried to hide. Facing one was a psychological challenge as much as a physical one, and many soldiers who survived encounters still spoke of the trauma and unease it left behind. Yet, despite this fear, American troops also witnessed the weapon's effectiveness. Flamethrowers could clear positions that had resisted days of assault. They forced defenders out of cover, disrupted fortifications, and saved lives by reducing the need for close-quarters assaults with rifles or grenades. But that tactical benefit did little to lessen the dread. Soldiers respected the weapon for its power, but that respect was inseparable from the fear it inspired. It wasn't just a tool of war. It was a symbol of the most primal, terrifying aspect of combat: fire. The legacy of these encounters lingered long after battles ended. In letters, diaries, and oral histories, GIs would recount the visceral terror of facing a flamethrower. It became a weapon that soldiers hated, not simply because it was dangerous, but because it represented a form of violence that was personal, intimate, and horrifying in its immediacy. Unlike the distant thunder of artillery or the impersonal threat of gunfire, the flamethrower brought the enemy and death directly into the same confined space. It was a weapon that left no room for abstraction, no space to rationalize survival. Facing it was a moment of sheer, unfiltered fear. And that fear shaped the way American soldiers remembered and understood the battles they fought. This combination of psychological terror and battlefield efficiency is what made the flamethrower unique and controversial. It wasn't just a weapon. It was an instrument of fear that forced soldiers to confront one of the most elemental threats imaginable, changing the way they thought about combat, survival, and the very nature of war itself. While the flamethrower inspired intense fear on the battlefield, it also had undeniable tactical value. And that's what made it both indispensable and deeply controversial. In combat, the weapon was devastatingly effective at clearing positions that were otherwise nearly impossible to assault. Japanese defenders in the Pacific had perfected the art of fortifying caves, bunkers, and pillboxes, creating environments where traditional infantry assaults were often suicidal. In Europe, German troops reinforced strongpoints with concrete, sandbags, and barbed wire. Rifles and grenades could only do so much. The flamethrower, by contrast, could project fire into these confined spaces, forcing defenders out or neutralizing them entirely. Its value lay in its ability to solve tactical problems in situations where soldiers would otherwise be trapped in long, deadly firefights. Operators carried portable fuel tanks on their backs, connected to nozzles that could project flames across distances of 20 to 40 feet. In jungle or urban environments, this allowed American soldiers to reach enemies hiding behind walls, inside bunkers, or deep in cave networks. The weapon could flush out enemy soldiers who were otherwise impossible to engage without taking heavy casualties. In this sense, the flamethrower saved lives. It reduced the need for soldiers to crawl into exposed positions or throw themselves directly at fortified positions. Yet the same effectiveness that made it valuable also made it terrifying to use. Carrying a flamethrower came with extreme risk. The fuel tanks were highly flammable, and a single bullet or grenade could ignite them, turning the operator into a moving torch. This vulnerability meant that only the bravest or most desperate soldiers could wield it, and many units developed strategies to protect flamethrower teams with covering fire and tactical coordination. The operator had to balance aggression with caution, advancing just close enough to use the weapon effectively while relying on fellow soldiers to shield them from enemy fire. Every deployment was a high-stakes gamble, and despite the fear it inspired in enemies, it also made the American soldiers themselves acutely aware of mortality. The human cost extended beyond the operators. Flamethrowers inflicted a particularly gruesome fate on those they targeted. Unlike bullets or shrapnel, which could kill instantly, fire caused injuries that were horrifyingly slow and painful. Witnessing or surviving such attacks left deep psychological scars on both the victims and the attackers. This led many American soldiers and officers to question the morality of the weapon. Letters, diaries, and post-war interviews reveal a recurring tension. Respect for the flamethrower's utility was constantly tempered by revulsion at the suffering it caused. It was a weapon that forced its users to confront the consequences of their actions in ways most conventional firearms did not. The tension between tactical necessity and human cost became central to debates over the weapon. Commanders relied on flamethrowers to achieve objectives that might otherwise have resulted in higher casualties, but soldiers' horror and the ethical implications were impossible to ignore. Even as it proved effective in combat, its reputation as a hated weapon grew. It was feared, respected, and morally ambiguous all at once. Its use raised questions about the limits of warfare and whether the end could justify the means. This duality, effectiveness and ethical controversy, was what defined the flamethrower's place in military history. It could decisively change the outcome of a battle. Yet it left lasting scars on the soldiers who used it and those who faced it. American GIs understood its power but also recoiled at its consequences. The flamethrower was more than a tool. It was a symbol of the brutal calculus of war, where necessity, fear, and morality collided on the battlefield. It forced soldiers, commanders, and eventually policymakers to confront the question: how far should one go in the pursuit of victory, and at what cost to humanity? In the end, the flamethrower's tactical effectiveness could not be separated from the human consequences it produced, and that tension defined its legacy. It was a weapon that worked, but it worked by making soldiers confront both fear and ethical responsibility, shaping the way American troops experienced and remembered some of the most intense battles of World War II. As the smoke of World War II cleared and the global conflict receded into history, the flamethrower remained a symbol of both power and horror. Its impact on the battlefield was undeniable, but so too was the controversy it inspired. The weapon's ability to clear bunkers, caves, and fortified positions came at a steep cost, one that weighed heavily not just on the enemy, but on the soldiers who wielded it and the moral conscience of the military as a whole. Over time, the tension between tactical necessity and human cost sparked intense debate, eventually leading to its formal ban by the U.S. military. In the years following World War II, military strategists began to reconsider the ethics of weapons that caused extreme suffering. Unlike conventional firearms, artillery, or even grenades, flamethrowers inflicted injuries that were horrifyingly slow and agonizing. Survivors of flamethrower attacks often faced burns covering large portions of their bodies, and even those who escaped direct flames suffered psychological trauma from witnessing the destruction. The public perception of the weapon contributed to growing unease. Stories of its use circulated in media and post-war accounts, painting the flamethrower as a particularly cruel instrument of war. This scrutiny placed pressure on military institutions to reevaluate its place in modern combat. At the same time, advancements in technology were changing the way wars were fought. By the Korean War, new weapons, ranging from precision artillery and aerial bombardment to emerging missile systems, offered alternatives to the close-range, high-risk tactics that flamethrowers required. Soldiers no longer needed to crawl toward a bunker to neutralize defenders when air support or explosives could accomplish the same objective from a distance. The combination of technological innovation and moral concern made the flamethrower increasingly anachronistic. Effective, perhaps, but no longer essential. The process of banning the weapon was gradual, reflecting both strategic and ethical considerations. Military planners weighed the flamethrower's tactical value against its dangers to operators and its psychological impact on troops. Many commanders acknowledged that while the flamethrower could save lives in specific situations by reducing the need for frontal assaults, it also introduced extreme risk and moral ambiguity into every engagement. The United States, along with other nations observing evolving international norms of warfare, began to classify the flamethrower as undesirable for future conflicts. By the late 20th century, it was officially phased out of active service, a decision shaped as much by ethics as by strategy. The ban also reflected a larger shift in the philosophy of modern warfare. Combat was no longer viewed solely in terms of territory gained or enemies destroyed. It was increasingly filtered through considerations of legality, humanity, and public perception. The international community, influenced by treaties and the rise of humanitarian law, questioned the use of weapons designed to cause extreme suffering. The flamethrower, with its terrifying and inescapable effects, became emblematic of the kind of brutality that modern military institutions sought to move away from. Its removal from the battlefield signaled an acknowledgement that moral responsibility and strategic effectiveness must coexist, even in the midst of war. Despite its ban, the legacy of the flamethrower lingers in military history. It remains a stark reminder of the tension between necessity and ethics, a weapon that forced soldiers to confront the darkest realities of combat. Veterans recalled not only the terror it inspired in their enemies but also the fear and moral weight it imposed on themselves. Commanders had to balance the immediate advantages of using the weapon against the long-term psychological and ethical costs. In this sense, the flamethrower serves as a case study in the broader evolution of warfare, how militaries adapt to new technology while grappling with the human consequences of their choices. Ultimately, the story of the flamethrower's ban is about more than just a single weapon. It illustrates the difficult moral calculus that accompanies military innovation, where effectiveness and ethics often collide. The weapon was feared, hated, and respected, but in the end, its continued use became impossible to justify. Its removal from service marked a turning point in the way armed forces approached the conduct of war, acknowledging that even in combat, there are lines that should not be crossed. The flamethrower's legacy endures as a reminder of both the ingenuity and the moral responsibility that shaped the battlefield.